Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 16, The New Age. Introduction. Any war performs two rather contradictory services for the social context in which it occurs. On the one hand, it changes the minds of men, especially the defeated, about the factual power relationship between the combatants. And on the other hand, it alters the factual situation itself, so that changes which in peacetime might have occurred over decades are brought about in a few years. This has been true of all wars, but never has it been truer than in respect to World War II. The age which began in 1945 was a new age from almost every point of view. Looking back, it is now clear that the first generation of the 20th century, from about 1895 to 1939, was a long period of transition from the 19th century world to a totally different world of the 20th century. Some of these changes are obvious: a shift from a period of democracy to an age of experts, from a world dominated by Europe and even by Britain, to a world divided into three great blocks. From a world in which man still lived, as he had for 1,000,000 years, surrounded by nature, to a situation where nature is dominated, transformed, and, in a sense, totally destroyed by man. From a system where man's greatest problems were the material ones of man's helplessness in the face of the natural threats of disease, starvation, and the unpredictability of natural catastrophes, to the total different system of the 1960s and 1970s, where the greatest threat to man is man himself, and where his greatest problems are the social and non-material ones of what his true goals of existence are, and what use he should make of his immense power over the universe, including his fellow men. For thousands of years, some men had viewed themselves as creatures a little lower than the angels, or even God, and a little higher than the beasts. Now, in the 20th century, man has acquired almost divine powers, and it has become increasingly clear that he can no longer regard himself as an animal, as the leading thinkers of the 19th century did, but must regard himself as at least a man, if he cannot bring himself to break so completely with his 19th century predecessors as to come to regard himself as obligated to act like an angel or even a god. The whole trend of the 19th century had been to emphasize man's animal nature, and in doing so, to seek to increase his supply of material necessities, his indulgence in creature comforts, his experiences of food, movement, sex, and emotion. This effort had resulted in the sharp curtailment, or almost total neglect, of the conventions of man's earlier history, conventions which had been, on the whole, based on a conception of man as a dualistic creature, in which an eternal spiritual soul was encased temporally in an ephemeral material body. This older conception had been embodied in the form in which the 19th century challenged it, largely in the 17th century, and had been reflected in that earlier period in the widespread influence of Puritanism, of Jansenism, and of other basically pessimistic, inhibiting, masochistic, and self-disciplining ideologies. The 18th century had been a long age of struggle to get free of this older 17th century outlook, and had been so prolonged largely because those who turned away from the 17th century could neither envisage nor agree upon the newer ideology they wanted to put in the place of the older one they wished to reject. This newer ideology was found in the 19th century, and may be regarded as one which emphasized man's freedom to indulge his more animal-like aspects, to obtain freedom for his body from disease, death, hunger, discomfort, and drudgery. This movement eventually gave us modern surgery and medical science, modern technology, mass production of food and other consumers' goods, central heating, indoor plumbing, domestic lighting, air conditioning, and the plethora of so-called labor-saving devices. The outlook behind these achievements may be symbolized by Charles Darwin, whose writings came to stand for proof of the animal nature of man, and of Sigmund Freud, whose writings were taken to show that sex was the dominant, if not the sole human motivation, and that inhibitions were the great bane of human life. This latter point of view came to be accepted on the most pervasive level of human experience, in the attacks on inhibitions and discipline, which we call progressive education, as represented in the outpourings of such semi-popular thinkers as Rousseau in the earliest stage of the movement, in Emile, or John Dewey in the latest stage. We who enter the 20th century must not assume, as earlier ages so often did, that our immediate predecessors were wrong, and that we should seek a point of view which appears true largely because it is opposed to them. This mistaken method of human progress has led men, in the past, to oscillate over the centuries from one extreme point of view to its opposite, and then, a few generations later, back again. Thus, the humanism of the 16th century had reacted against the scholasticism of the medieval period, and was reacted against in turn by the Puritanism of the 17th century, the materialism of the 19th century, and the reaction against this latest outlook by the flight from freedom and blind mass discipline of reactionary totalitarianism and the fascist and Nazi aberrations. It should be evident by now that truth is a remote goal which man approaches by walking, a process in which one foot is always behind the other foot. The true and final goal of man as we know him must be a synthesis of varied elements, because man is so obviously a creature of varied nature. And our imperfect vision, both of man's nature and of the universe in which he operates, must be a consensus of divergent points of view, since man's obviously limited vision permits each individual, group, or age to see the truth in a partial fashion only. Any consensus, however temporary, must be a reconciliation of such divergent and partial views to provide a more adequate, but still temporary, total view. This can be seen, most essentially, in the fact that the great achievements of the 19th century and the great crisis of the 20th century are both related to the Puritan tradition of the 17th century. The Puritan point of view regarded the body and the material world as sinful and dangerous, and, as such, something which must be sternly controlled by the individual's will. God's grace, it was felt, would give the individual the strength to curb both his body and his feelings, to control their tendencies toward laziness, the distractions of pleasure, and the diversions of enjoyment, and make it possible for the individual, by total application to work, to demonstrate that he was among the chosen recipients of God's grace. This Puritan outlook, rejected outwardly in the 19th century's vision of the truth, was, nevertheless, still an influential element in the 19th century's behavior, especially among those who contributed most to the 19th century's achievement of its own goals. The Puritan point of view contributed elements of self-discipline, self-denial, masochism, glorification of work, emphasis on the restrictions of enjoyment, of consumption, and subordination both of the present to the future and of one's self to a larger whole. These became significant elements in the bourgeois middle-class pattern of behavior which dominated the 19th century. The middle classes were themselves largely products of the 17th century, and had adopted this point of view as one of the features which distinguished them from the more self-indulgent attitudes of the other two social classes, the peasants below them, or the aristocracy and nobility above them. In the 19th century, the elements of the Puritan point of view were quite detached from the other worldly goals they had served in the 17th century, God and personal salvation, and were attached to individualistic and largely selfish, this worldly goals. But they carried over attitudes and patterns of behavior which remained largely detached from the 19th century's stated goals, and these, by a combination of 17th century methods with 19th century goals, produced the immense physical achievements of the 19th century. These methods appeared in a number of essential ways, notably in an emphasis on self-discipline for future benefits, on restricted consumption, and on saving, which provided the capital accumulation of the 19th century's industrial development, in a devotion to work, and in a postponement of enjoyment to a future which never arrived. A typical example might be John D. Rockefeller, great saver, great worker, and great postponer of any self-centered action, even to death. To such people, and to the prevalent middle-class ideology of the 19th century, the most adverse comments which could be made about a failure to distinguish him from a successful man were that he was a wastrel, a loafer, a sensualist, and self-indulgent. These terms reflected the value that the middle classes placed on work, saving, self-denial, and social conformity. All these values were carried over from the 17th century Puritanism and were found most frequently among the religious groups rooted in that century: the Quakers, Presbyterians, Nonconformists, so called in England, and Jansenist survivalists, and were less evident among religious groups with older orientations, such as Roman Catholics, High Anglicans, or Orthodox Christians. These older creeds were more prevalent among the lower and the upper classes, and in southern and eastern Europe rather than in northern or western Europe. This explains why the energy, self-discipline, and saving which made the world of 1900 was middle class, Protestant, and northwestern European. As we shall see later, in discussion of the American crisis of the 20th century, these outlooks, values, and groups are now being superseded by quite different outlooks, values, and groups. In America today, those who wish to preserve them frequently show a tendency to embrace fanatical right-wing political groups to implement that effort, and often speak among themselves of their efforts to preserve the values of WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. We shall speak later of these essential features of the 19th century point of view, because their disappearance in the 20th century, associated as it is with the crisis of the middle classes, is an essential part of the crisis of the 20th century, where it is to be seen most clearly in the English-speaking and Scandinavian countries. We shall call these features, as a single bundle, future preference, and understand that it includes the gospel of saving, of work, and of postponed enjoyment, consumption, and leisure. Closely related to it is a somewhat different idea, based on a constant and irremediable dissatisfaction with one's present position and present possessions. This is associated with the 19th century's emphasis on acquisitive behavior, on achievement, and on infinitely expansible demand, and is equally associated with the middle-class outlook. Both of these together, future preference and expansible material demands, were basic features in 19th century middle-class society, and indispensable foundations for its great material achievements. They are inevitably lacking in backward, tribal, underdeveloped peasant societies and groups, not only in Africa and Asia, but also in many peripheral areas and groups of Western civilization, including much of the Mediterranean, Latin American, Central France, or in the Mennonite communities of southern Pennsylvania and elsewhere. The lack of future preference and expansible material demands in other areas, and the weakening of them in middle-class Western civilization, are essential features of the 20th century crisis. Though this crisis, which has appeared as a breakdown, disruption, and rejection of the 19th century's way of doing things, was fully evident by the year 1900, it was brought to an acute stage by the 2 world wars and the World Depression. If we may be permitted to oversimplify, 2 analytical ways of dealing with this crisis appeared. One way, Going back to men like George Sorel, Reflections on Violence, 1908, sought a solution of this crisis in irrationalism, in action for its own sake, in submergence of the individual into the mass of his tribe, community, or nation, in simple, intense concrete feelings and acts. The other tendency, based on 19th century's science, sought a solution of the crisis in rationalization, science, universality, cosmopolitanism, and the continued pursuit of eternal, if rapidly retreating, truth. While the great mass of people in Western civilization either ignored the problem and the antithetical character of the two proffered solutions, drifting unconsciously toward the one or struggling confusedly toward the other, two smaller groups were quite aware of the antithesis and rivalry of the two. From the crisis itself and the myriad individual events which led through it came World War II. Although few were consciously aware of it, this war became a struggle between the forces of irrationality, represented by fascism, and the forces of Western science and rationalization, represented by the Allied nations. The Allied nations won this fearful struggle because they represented the forces of the ancient traditions of the West, which had made Western civilization the most powerful and most prosperous civilization that had ever existed in the past 6,000 years of experience of this form of human organization. This ability to use the Western tradition appeared in a capacity to use rationalization, science, diversity, freedom, and voluntary cooperation, all long existent attributes of Western civilization.